Hi everybody. Hope you've been enjoying your food. We're going to move on to the speaker portion now, and we have a really wonderful speaker I know you're going to really enjoy. We're very excited to have her, so I'm going to introduce you to her right now. Dr. Mary J. Ruwart is a research scientist and long-term libertarian activist. She's the author of the international bestseller Healing Our World, which emphasizes the practical and compassionate aspects of the libertarian philosophy. Dr. Ruwart has also written short answers to the tough questions based on the web columns she writes for the Advocates for Self-Government. And she's also on the board of ISIL, who has a booth here with us, so please go and check that out in the captain's room. We've asked Dr. Ruwart to share her thoughts about the impact of liberty on women and minorities specifically. So please help me welcome Dr. Mary Ruwart.
Follow that.
Well, thank you for inviting me here to the California Convention. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited about the topic I have today, because I don't think we talk enough about the problem that minorities and women have. You know, when they come to us and say, do you support affirmative action or quotas or equal opportunity, we tend to say, no, people have a right to discriminate. And we end up coming off sounding rather hard-hearted. And this is really a tragedy, because liberty is the compassionate choice. And today, I'd actually like to share 3 different ideas with you that relate to this, and kind of put in your mind the idea that a lot of the prejudice and a lot of the discrimination that we see today has actually been legalized through laws that only appear to be gender or race neutral. And I'd also like to suggest to you, as my second idea, that only libertarians are doing anything to solve the problem. And thirdly, I'd like to suggest to you that quotas, affirmative action, equal opportunity laws, things of this nature, actually backfire, and they harm the very people that they're intended to help. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to use as my main example, the situation with the blacks, because the African American people have really taken the brunt of these laws, although a lot of them apply to women as well, as you'll see. They only appear to be race and gender neutral. And to examine that, I want to talk a little bit about what happened to the black slaves after the Civil War, because there's an era of history that I think has been lost to most of us. Immediately after the Civil War, of course, things were in somewhat chaotic state. But by 1877, just 12 years after the Civil War ended, there were 600 blacks in the state legislatures. And there were about 16 of them in Congress. Now, yes, when they got to Congress, sometimes their vote count was challenged, and sometimes they had to fight a little harder than the other representatives to be seated, but they were seated. And that was doing pretty good for a people who were basically landless and had nothing when they had started out. Now, of course, during the slave period, it was against the law in most states to teach blacks how to read and write. So at emancipation, literacy rate for that population was about 7%, very low. But by 1900, it had already increased to 70%, 70. That's remarkable. It's just incredible. In fact, people who visited the South and noted this were just floored. They said, nothing like this has ever happened. How did it happen? Well, it wasn't through the public schools. In fact, by 1900, 3/4 of the black population that were going to high school were in private schools. So you can see most of the effort was private. And in fact, a number of northern school marms, as they were called, migrated down to the South and volunteered their services to help teach the blacks to read and write. And in some cases, they were funded or taken care of by private donations from a number of benefactors, some in the North and some in the South. And of course, the black people themselves contributed greatly to their own education in a couple different ways. First of all, the tradesmen helped build the schools. You know, they gave their labor for free, basically. And many of the materials were donated by the communities. In addition, of course, the black people were very eager to learn. Our African American population was just starved for education, and they knew that this was the ticket to their economic stability, and so they did enormous things, made enormous sacrifices, even if it meant paying for private tuition for their child so that they could go to school and get an education. Now, another interesting thing that happened during this time is, of course, the plantation owners did not like the idea of having to pay people that they had had in bondage for so long. And so they ran ads in the newspapers and said, hey, if we all stick together and pay slave wages, well, there won't be any way for these black people to get out of it. You know, we can keep paying low wages. Or if we're giving them a share of the crop, let's just give them a small share. We'll just set it real low. They actually took out ads in the papers to do this. But the problem they had was when one of their members saw their fields and their crops rotting because they didn't have enough help, what did they do? They said, hey, if you come to my place, I'll pay you a little more, or I'll give you a bigger share. And so they never could quite collude successfully. Consequently, you know, market prices pretty much prevailed, and the way, blacks still did get cheated. I don't want to make light of what they were up against. If they couldn't figure out what their share was, or if they couldn't do the math in order to make sure their wages were right, a lot of people cheated them. But as far as the prevailing wage or share, it was pretty close to what the whites were getting. In fact, the whites weren't working much because all the skilled laborers in the South were ex-slaves, right? So they had to hire them. And there wasn't really that much competition, at least initially, in the trades in the South. And another thing that happened was that pre-Civil War, the blacks had been living on the plantations in close proximity to their white masters. And they had been nannies, they had been wet nurses, they had been housekeepers. So that proximity was necessary to even keep up the way the system was working, because of course the white people still wanted to hire them as nannies and housekeepers and wet nurses. So integration actually at that point in time wasn't an issue. The integration that had already existed continued. Now, you might think that had this continued, that the black population would be totally integrated today. And in fact, that integration was going so well that intermarriage began to occur. Yes, it was socially unacceptable, but it was happening, especially since a lot of the white men didn't come back from the Civil War, or if they came back, remained. And so what began to happen were white women were intermarrying with black men. And this really was uncomfortable for a lot of the white population. So what they did is they began the process of legislating what we are now going to see and evolve to the situation that we had prior to the civil rights riots and the Civil Rights Act that happened in the mid-last century. Now, think about it for a moment. If intermarriage hadn't been occurring, would there have to be a law to stop it? No, of course not. And would that law have been possible in a libertarian society? Of course not, because a libertarian government couldn't make a law forbidding marriage between races. In fact, a libertarian society couldn't make any kind of law influencing marriage. And marriage is one of the greatest integrators. The Romans, when they would conquer a territory, would go in And they would encourage their soldiers to intermarry with the conquered people. They would also encourage them to adopt the orphans that had lost their parents during the campaign. Why? Because they knew that if they integrated their population with adoption and intermarriage, there would be very little strife. So intermarriage is a great way to go for integrating, but it was outlawed in the South. And in addition, because the legislatures realized that as long as the populations were integrated, that there would be intermarriage, or at least intermingling, they began to have segregation laws. Now, could segregation laws have happened in a libertarian society? No, because in a libertarian society, we could not tell a business that they must not serve the blacks and only serve the whites, or separate them before serving them. That just wouldn't have happened in a libertarian society. Now, as the West opened up, and the North began to need more laborers, as a lot of theirs went to the West, there was a big push for Southern blacks to move into those areas. Now, of course, they were poor and they couldn't always afford the plane ticket or the train ticket, so what would happen is immigrant agents would come in and offer to pay their fare and recruit them for the higher wages in the Western North. But the Southern plantation owners didn't like that either. The free market was working to give the blacks a better job, so what happened in the Southern states is immigrant agents were essentially outlawed. They had to be licensed, and the fee for that license was very high, or the tax on the license was high. And so immigrant agents were effectively outlawed by making it too difficult. And that entrapped the black population in the South. Now, would a law against immigrant agents be possible in a libertarian society? Of course not. Because in a libertarian society, government can't make laws saying how you do business together. But of course, many of the blacks did migrate to the West and South, and there was prejudice as well. And so what happened in those areas is the white craftsmen who were threatened by the blacks decided that they would institute something called licensing laws. This meant that those who were already working as a plumber, carpenter, or electrician could make the rules for the new entrants. So what did they do? They said, well, you have to pass a written test. Now again, many of the blacks were just learning to read or write and couldn't always do that. So they were automatically excluded. Or perhaps there was a big fee involved. And so, of course, a poor black person couldn't afford that. In fact, Walter Williams, the black economist, used to tell stories about how his father, who was an electrician, would go and wire an entire house. And then, before his father could get paid, he had to bring in a white electrician who was licensed. And that electrician would have to sign off on the paperwork so that they could get paid for the job. Well, would licensing laws happen in a libertarian society? No, they would not. So had a society been more libertarian, the blacks wouldn't have these problems. And of course, women are also subject to these same laws, which put people who are at an economic disadvantage to further disadvantage. In fact, one of the licensing laws involved the licensing of physicians. In the early 1900s, the American Medical Association got control of the licensing process, which they had lobbied for several decades. And they decided that unless you went to a full-time medical school, one that they approved of, you couldn't get your medical degree. They surveyed all the medical schools, and you know what? They found out that the medical schools that trained women just weren't good enough. And so that graduates from those schools would not get their MD. That's how women were put out of the medical profession. It was the same for blacks. They were going to get rid of all of the schools. But then they start talking about it and saying, well, you know, will the white physicians really want to treat the black people, and shouldn't they have someone of their own color to treat them? We better leave a couple of them in business. So a couple of those survived. But the ones for women, oh, they were gone. Could this have happened in a libertarian society? No. In 1932, after the Great Depression started, the Agricultural Adjustment Act began paying farmers not to plant. But guess what? They paid people who owned the land not to plant. They didn't pay sharecroppers not to plant. Now, guess who the sharecroppers were? Mostly they were black. And about 25% of the sharecroppers had to give up farming during that time because, of course, they had no way to survive when they weren't getting paid, when they weren't getting paid not to plant. Of course, this wouldn't have happened in a libertarian society either. Now, beginning in the 1900s, government schools became more prevalent. And of course, you know what happens with government schools. Property taxes are collected and the school boards distribute them. Now, you might imagine that when the all-white school boards distributed these tax dollars in the South, that the black schools didn't end up with very much. In fact, they often ended up with just a third of what the white schools ended up having. And this was a big problem because as public education became more predominant, government schools became more predominant. At the same time this was happening, neighborhoods were becoming a little more segregated, especially in the cities. And as you know, when you're going to a government school, you have to go to the local one. So if the local school wasn't getting enough tax dollars to be run properly, then there were very few options. Parents of children either had to put up more money in order to help that school function, or they had to send their children to a private school, or maybe educate them at home. And this segregation that was starting to happen, especially in the cities, was helped along by none other than the Federal Housing Authority. You may not know it, but between 1930 and 1950, 60% of all mortgages were made by the FHA. And the FHA had a policy that they would only loan to white neighborhoods. And if the neighborhood was iffy, they were redlined. And if the neighborhood was black, well, they just didn't loan in those areas. So about 2% of all these loans went to non-whites. Would this have happened in a libertarian society? No, because government wouldn't be in the mortgage business in a libertarian society. In 1955, the minimum wage, which had been around for some time, was greatly expanded. This really made life difficult for young black men. When they tried to enter the workforce, their bargaining chip was that they would work for less than whites. Was this fair? Well, not in an ideal world, but what they were able to do is at least get that first job, so they would underbid their white counterparts. Now, the minimum wage, by demanding that employers pay something a little bit higher than they wanted to in the first place, meant that it didn't cost them anything to discriminate. Before, if the black person could say, well, I'll work for a couple dollars less, then the employer would recognize that they would lose money if they didn't employ the black person. But now, they had real no incentive to do that because the black person couldn't underbid. I even had instances when I was renovating low-income housing in the Kalamazoo area where I'd have people come up to me that were partially disabled and beg me to work for $2 an hour. But because the minimum wage was $3 an hour at that time, I didn't dare do it for fear that I'd be later sued. This is a real disincentive to employers. In fact, black economist Walter Williams has said that the minimum wage is the most anti-Negro law on the book. Why? Because it hurts the economically disadvantaged, and the blacks are disproportionately represented in that group. In fact, if you look in my book, Healing Our World, figure 3.1 actually shows a graph which shows as minimum wage coverage is going up, the ability of young blacks to get jobs are going down. It used to be that more young blacks were employed than young white people, but after the minimum wage, there was only, the young black person would only have about a 50-50 chance of getting a job. About 50% of the blacks were put out of jobs by the minimum wage. That's huge. That's huge. And then, to add insult to injury, in 1964, the war on poverty began. Welfare. I was renting to low-income people during the late 70s and throughout the 80s, and I would have young women come to me who were pregnant, and they would say, well, I'll be delivering my child in 3 months, and then the welfare will give me a check for housing, food stamps, and some money to take care of my child. So, can I sign up for an apartment? Now, if this young woman, who usually was going to be dropping out of high school to have this child, took that money from the government, she couldn't live with the father of her child, because if she did, she wouldn't get welfare. This was supposed to be for abandoned mothers. So naturally, it made sense for the man to abandon his family. So this really broke up the black families. In addition, this young woman, who might be 15 or 16, would find out when she had her first child that it's very difficult to raise a child on the pittance that they get from welfare. But in Michigan, where I was operating at that time, you can have a second child and get more money, a bigger place, more food stamps. And so that looked very attractive to someone who came from a poor environment. It might not look very attractive to any of us, but it looks very attractive to someone who has very little. So she'd have the second child, and then the third child to get even more money. And after the third child, the welfare increases stopped. So by the time this young woman was able to vote, right around that time, she'd look at her life and say, I'm not going to get anywhere. This isn't going to work. I need to get a job. But going into the workforce with 3 children at home is very difficult, because unless she had a relative that would take those children, she couldn't afford childcare for 3 children on the entry-level job that she was going to get without a high school diploma. It might have been okay in high school to get that kind of a job when she had no children and then work her way up, but it wasn't enough to support a family on. And so very rapidly, these women would get out of the workforce for a month, recognize that they just couldn't make it that way, and go back on welfare and be forever trapped. The young men didn't fare much better. They could get some welfare, but not quite enough. But they were really disenfranchised from their families. And studies show that young men who have a family are more likely to get a job and stay in the workforce and progress financially because they have that family that's depending on them. But without that family, there wasn't that incentive. And in addition, many times the black males really felt like they just weren't needed because of the way the system was structured. In fact, they were actually a liability to their family. That had to be very hard for them. So perhaps it's not surprising that the young blacks, unable to get a job because of minimum wage, unable to be an entrepreneur because of licensing laws, and really too poorly educated by their government schools, which didn't get as much money many times as the white schools did. It's no wonder really, when you think about it, that they had very little choices and felt very discouraged and might have turned to stealing and dealing. The problem is, the war on drugs itself is fraught with discrimination. Users of drugs in the white population and the black population are very similar. And yet, if you're black, you're 10 times more likely to get arrested, 10 times more likely to get convicted, 10 times more likely to serve time, and longer time than your white counterpart. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard Ron Paul talk about this. The war on drugs is one of the most racist pieces of legislation that we have today. And I could go on. I've really covered about half of the things, probably less than that. I probably don't even know all the things that have pushed the black population, and in many cases the female population, into an economically disadvantaged position. And you know, the Democrats aren't helping them, the Republicans aren't helping them. The only thing that minorities get from the Democrats and Republicans really are the offer of maybe a little higher welfare check. But you know who is coming to the rescue? The libertarians. How many of you have heard about the Institute for Justice? Can I see a show of hands? Oh, that's great, almost all of you. What a great group. If you don't know about them, I'm going to tell you about them and suggest that you look up their website, ij.org, www.ij.org. What they do is they're libertarian lawyers who do pro bono work for people who are crushed by these regulations. They started out with African American hair braiders who were putting those little locks in people's hair. And there was even a young lady in Kansas who was a high school girl, started her own boutique, was given a national award for her entrepreneurship, and when she returned to Kansas was threatened with jail time by the legislatures for practicing cosmetology without a license. Yeah, it's interesting. In most states, cosmetology license costs about $5,000, and it takes about a year to get them. They don't teach braiding, but they do teach shampooing, cutting hair, and perms, hair coloring, things of this nature. Well, this was happening in so many states, and as you can imagine, most of these boutique operators were minorities. Many were female. They were having a difficult time, and so the Institute for Justice took their case on in several states and won on the grounds, yes. On the grounds that this was unconstitutional to prevent people from earning a living. Oh, that's great. And they did the same thing for taxi and limo drivers. In many cities, you have to have a license or a medallion to operate a taxi, and there's a limited number, so they're bid on in the open market, they're auctioned off. And in New York City, I think the last quote I heard was $250,000. Now, you can imagine a poor person would have enough money to have a car and be able to give taxi service, but if they've got to pay $250,000 first, well, that's out of the question. So the same thing happens with limos. In fact, in some areas, in order to start your own limousine service on a particular route, you have to show that it's not going to interfere with anybody now operating. So, of course, when that hearing comes time for the hearing, all the operators who are in business come forward and say, oh, this is going to hurt me, and that's the end of it. Of course, even if you want to apply, you better have high-powered legal people, because there are processes you have to go through that are very expensive if you want to have a prayer. So this keeps a lot of people who could start an entrepreneurial business, especially minorities, out of business. And the Institute for Justice has successfully taken on their cases as well. So that's very great. But you know, the one area I was really excited about that the Institute for Justice took on was a Texas case of adoption. Remember earlier in this talk, we mentioned that the Romans intermarried and adopted. Well, what you might not know is that back in the early 1900s, when most adoption agencies were run by private or religious organizations, they frequently would place people in an interracial situation. They would place a black baby with white parents, for example. This is very good because, again, this is part of the way you integrate a society. But as licensing laws and regulations grew, these religious organizations and their orphanage and adoption agencies were pushed out. And so much of the adoption today takes place through government social services. And even though the law in many states prohibits race as being a condition of adoption, these social workers have decided in many states that it isn't a good thing to place a black child with white parents because then he won't have the proper cultural upbringing. Now that means these children generally languish in foster homes because there are a lot of white couples that want to adopt, and there's lots of black babies. but there aren't a lot of black couples that want to adopt, just by sheer numbers, if you think about it. And there's a lot of troubled black babies, crack babies, children with medical problems, and the white couples are often very interested even in taking on these problems, but they aren't allowed to. One couple was especially angered by this. They were in Texas, the man was white, the woman was Native American. They had already adopted 2 of the wife's younger sisters. They'd had a child of their own. They had adopted 2 black children through a private agency in the past, and they were fostering a black child who had a brother, and they wanted to adopt both of the brothers, and they were prevented from it because the social workers didn't feel it was a good cultural fit. So the Institute for Justice took on the case and won. And this has really changed the way adoptions are done in this country today. This is really, I think, a great stride for integration. Again, only the libertarians are fighting these licensing laws and these regulations and these supposedly colorblind things that actually work against those who are the most disadvantaged. And of course, minorities are highly represented in that disadvantaged population. Now, one might ask, until this all falls out, until we get rid of these things that really inhibit the integration of minorities into our society, shouldn't we have affirmative action, quotas, and equal opportunity programs? Well, from what I have seen, they backfire every time, and they hurt the very people they're intended to help. When I was in corporate America, we were, of course, required as a company to hire a certain number of minorities for quotas. And what was very sad about this is I would hear my colleagues talking about the new hire even before they met him or her. And they talk about them in a very derogatory way. Oh yeah, they probably just got the job because of their skin color. And so right away, in an environment where cooperation and teamwork is so important, the new hires were already at a disadvantage. Their colleagues already didn't believe in them. And in addition, I have to think that many people who are hired under these programs have to wonder, would I have gotten the job if not for my skin color or if not for my gender? I think that would be a very, debilitating thought, something that would really threaten one's sense of self-worth and have other repercussions. So from just a psychological point of view, they're bad. But you know, it's even more distressing than that, because what really ends up happening is all of these programs are applied to areas where the minorities are underrepresented. So let's say in the case that I was discussing, I was a research scientist in a pharmaceutical firm. Blacks, for example, are not highly represented there. So what that means is that a black person might come in and be sought after because of these quotas and things, and they might actually be paid more than their white counterpart simply because the companies have to bid to get these small number of minorities to meet their quotas, right? But on the other hand, remember that every government program costs money. It costs the company money, and it costs the taxpayer money, either in taxes or in inflation. We all know about the inflation tax. And again, I'm sure you're aware of this, but if you're not, just check out figure 12.1 in Healing Our World. It shows that the greater percentage of a country's wealth that the government spends, the less wealth you create. Why? Because obviously we know the government's inefficient, right? So the more of our money that the government spends, the less we end up making the next year. So when we spend money on affirmative action programs, we're putting this whole thing into play. And how it plays out is that marginal businesses can't make it because they're paying for these programs either through inflation or taxes or something. They go out of business. And who gets laid off? Usually the disadvantaged worker, the unskilled worker. They have a hard time finding a job. So what ends up happening with all these programs is the professional minority gets paid more, but the unskilled minority gets paid a lot less. They lose their job. And you can actually see this because studies show that professional blacks, for example, make more money than their white counterparts. And, not surprisingly, the unskilled minorities make less than their white counterparts. It's a little different for women. For women, if you factor out the time they spend on pregnancy leave or childbearing or not being in the workforce because of those reasons, and you just compare the woman's salary to a man, if they had equal time, they're pretty much paid equally. So women have done much better in this race than the blacks have done. And I don't know, I guess maybe it's because they're sleeping with the enemy. Familiarity. Familiarity, you know. We all know people of other sexes, but not all white people can say they have good black friends, for example. So I think maybe familiarity is part of that. And that all goes back to this adoption and intermarriage, because of course that's what adoption and intermarriage does. It brings somebody from a different culture into the family as an accepted individual. So in summary, I'd just like to go over the points that I was trying to make in this talk, because I think they're very important for us to keep in mind when we're talking to women and minorities. First of all, the prejudice and discrimination that we see in our culture today is really reinforced by legislation that wouldn't happen in a libertarian society. Legislation that appears to be gender neutral or race neutral, but actually puts anyone who's at an economic disadvantage at further disadvantage. And secondly, only the libertarians are out there trying to change that. The Democrats and Republicans don't even know what the problem is. So I think that's something that we should be proud of. And thirdly, quotas, affirmative action, and equal opportunity programs actually backfire, hurting the very people they're intended to help. And as such, we as libertarians cannot support them. Now, I know I've covered a lot of material in this talk, but one of the points that I hope you've seen is that in many cases we simply just don't know the history of liberty. We've lost it. Maybe not surprisingly, since government schools predominate our educational system. And so what I invite you to do, if you're interested in stories like this and more information on how liberty works, is to go ahead and go to my website at ruwart.com, ruwart.com, and please feel free to download the free download of my book, Healing Our World, the 1992 version, and learn more about these things. I do have the 2003 version, which is greatly updated here at the convention today, but I don't want anyone to go away thinking that they can't get this information because they're having a hard time financially. So please be sure and visit my website or visit my table today and learn more about it, because I believe that the reason that we haven't been able to talk to people about liberty oftentimes is that we simply don't know how liberty works, because that information has been buried. And my job that I've taken on is to try to make this information available so that we can go and show people how wonderful liberty is, that liberty works, and liberty is the compassionate choice. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions, but if we do, I'd be happy to take them.
A couple minutes, maybe.
A couple minutes? Okay.
We do need a couple minutes for you.
Oh, yes, okay. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you might expand upon a point that I think you just started to touch on regarding affirmative action, and that is that another way it might hurt minorities and women is that less qualified people are bid for in schools and jobs, and thereby sometimes get themselves into situations where they'll fail because they aren't quite qualified enough, whereas if they took some other job, they'd have a better chance of succeeding.
Did everyone hear the question? Basically, he was asking for me to comment on the idea that if somebody who isn't as well qualified as they should be for a job gets it because of race or gender, that puts them in a place to fail. And again, studies show that that's exactly what happens. And I remember an instance in the corporation I was in where not only was the person not making it, but they were really giving a bad name to everybody else in the sense that it was reinforcing the prejudice because this person wasn't performing well. So again, it just snowballs. So you're so right, that is exactly what happens. Yes?
You talked about the Institute for Justice. Are you familiar with a very similar organization called the Pacific Legal Foundation?
The Pacific Legal Foundation is,
Right.
I'm not familiar with it, but I want to repeat what you said so other people that might not have heard it. But evidently the Pacific Legal Foundation is similar to the Institute for Justice. Do you know their website?
PLF.org, I believe. No,
P-
but pacificlegal.org, I think.
Pacificlegal.org, okay. Yeah. Thank you for telling me that. I wasn't aware of that, and I'm glad you did because I'd like to be aware of that. Okay, well, I don't see any of their hands up, so I'm going to turn it back over to the organizers because they have some fun and games for you.